Silas Drake awoke early in the morning, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the bedroom blinds. He was 37 years old, and he was accustomed to starting his day long before the city of Milwaukee was fully awake. Laurel, his wife, lay on the bed next to him. She was 35. She had turned over and was muttering softly in her sleep. Silas carefully climbed out of bed, trying not to wake her. In the kitchen, he set the coffee pot on the stove. The faint aroma of freshly ground beans began to fill the space. The house they had lived in for the past 6 years was small but cozy. White walls, hardwood floors, and family photos lined the shelves gave it a sense of stability and warmth. One of the photos, taped to the refrigerator, showed Silas and Laurel smiling and hugging each other on the shore of Lake Michigan. It had been taken several years ago, before Silas had had surgery. They had only been married a couple of years and seemed so carefree and happy. Silas briefly remembered that day. They had just celebrated their second wedding anniversary, walking along the beach, fooling around in the sand and salt spray of the lake. Laurel had laughed loudly and infectiously, running from the waves, and he had caught her in his arms. That was how he remembered that day, full of carefree laughter and love. Now, when Laurel smiled, Silas sometimes noticed a shadow of weariness or worry. Silas poured himself a cup of coffee and looked out the window. He could see a quiet street with the occasional car passing by. The morning was cool, and the air was already filled with the scent of autumn. He took a thoughtful sip and thought back to the evening before. Laurel had come home from work later than usual, saying she had been held up at the clinic by an unscheduled patient. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but lately such delays had been happening more often. Laurel had seemed tired when she returned home yesterday. Silas had noticed that she had barely spoken at dinner, lost in her thoughts. He had tried to ask her about her day, but had received short, monosyllabic answers. After dinner, she went straight to the bedroom, citing a headache. This was unusual behavior for her. They had been such a harmonious couple before he was more calm and reasonable. She was lively and emotional. They often shared little things with each other, discussed plans for the week, or recalled funny incidents from the day. Now, there was an invisible wall between them. Silas knew that much had changed since his spinal surgery 6 months earlier. It had taken him months to recover physically. The surgery had been difficult, and their intimate life had virtually ceased to exist during the recovery period. Laurel had been incredibly patient back then, helping him, supporting him, driving him to physical therapy. He was grateful to her and believed that their marriage had survived the ordeal. However, once he had recovered, he found that returning to their former intimacy had been difficult. He was almost fine physically, but there seemed to be a cautious distance between them. He hoped that things would improve with time. After finishing his coffee, Silas quietly opened his laptop on the kitchen table, trying not to make any noise. Ahead of him lay a working day as an engineer, drawings, calls with colleagues, solving technical problems. Work was an outlet for him and a clear world where everything was subject to logic and calculation. In his personal life, there was less logic. He tried to convince himself that the tension between them was temporary, the result of stress or fatigue. Perhaps memories of the difficult period with the operation still affected Laurel's mood. Or she was simply overloaded with work at the clinic. There were soft footsteps from the bedroom as Laurel woke up. She came into the kitchen in a soft robe, her light brown hair slightly disheveled. Silas looked up and smiled at her, trying to hide his worry. "Good morning," he said quietly. "I made some coffee. Would you like a cup?" Laurel nodded and tried to smile back, but it came out weak. "Good day," she replied, sitting down on a chair. "Yes, please." He poured her coffee. They sat in silence for a while. Laurel wrapped her hands around the mug, as if trying to keep warm, and looked out the window wearily. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and the noise of the cars outside. "What time are you getting home from work today?" Silas asked casually, pretending that his question was accidental. He wanted to know if she would be home late again. I'm not sure," Laurel said after a pause. "Maybe a little later than usual. We've got a couple of new patients, so we might have to wait a bit longer with the paperwork." She spoke calmly, but avoided meeting his eyes. Silas felt an unpleasant chill in his gut. She had tried to warn him in advance if she was going to be late. Now it happens so often that it has become almost routine. "I see," he said quietly, looking at his reflection in the black surface of the cooling coffee. Laurel finished her coffee and stood up from the table. "I have to get going," she said. "Thanks for the coffee." He watched her leave the kitchen. It seemed to him that Laurel had deliberately retreated before the conversation could go deeper. His heart sank. For the last few weeks, Silas had been feeling that something was wrong. He didn't know what it was yet, but he knew that something had changed in their cozy little home. Throughout the day, Silas had been haunted by an uneasy feeling. Several times at work, he caught himself thinking about Laurel. He remembered her tired eyes and evasive answers. Usually, at such times, he tried to distract himself with work, but this time it was not so successful. At noon, after finishing his morning chores, Silas decided to surprise his wife. He remembered that Laurel had a favorite cafe near the clinic where she worked, where she sometimes stopped for a salad or coffee. The idea of having lunch together seemed like a good way to spend time together, since they had barely spoken the night before. He got ready, left the office, and drove to the clinic. It was a sunny but cool fall day in Milwaukee. It was 1:45 when Silas parked outside the private clinic where Laurel worked. He entered the lobby and headed to the reception desk. Smiling affably, he asked, "Hello, is Laurel Drake in the clinic now? I'm her husband. I'd like to see her if she's on her lunch break." The young girl at the reception looked up from her computer screen. "Hello. Laurel went out for lunch about 10 minutes ago. I think she was going to the cafe around the corner," she replied pleasantly. "I see, thank you," Silas nodded. A little disappointed that he hadn't found his wife there, he decided to go to that very cafe. The Riverside Cafe was a cozy place, with large windows letting in daylight and a few tables occupied by patrons, the sound of conversation and the clink of dishes. Old photographs of Milwaukee hung on the walls, creating an almost homey atmosphere. It was Laurel's favorite place. Silas remembered them eating there a couple of times after her shift ended. He slowed as he approached the entrance, peering through the glass. His gaze immediately caught a familiar silhouette. Laurel was sitting at a table by the window. Opposite her was a man of about 40, wearing a white medical coat, obviously a fellow doctor. They were both talking animatedly. Laurel was even smiling, and there was none of the tiredness in her smile that Silas had seen at home. She seemed engrossed in the conversation. Silas's heart sank. He knew instantly that this man was the doctor Laurel had mentioned a couple of times in recent months, Rowan Price. The name came back to him. Laurel had told him one evening about a new doctor at the clinic, a talented specialist who had recently joined their rehabilitation unit. She had spoken admiringly of some successful cases in which Dr. Price had been involved. Silas had never dreamed that this man could be the cause of his concern. He took a step back from the window, trying to remain unnoticed. Laurel and Rowan didn't seem to see him from the street. Silas watched for a few moments longer. Rowan was talking, his gestures animated, and Laurel was listening intently, nodding or responding occasionally. There was a strange rapport between them, or so it seemed. At one point, Rowan leaned forward and lightly touched Laurel's hand on the table as she laughed at his joke. The gesture was brief, but it made Silas's chest go cold. He turned away, a bitter lump rising in his throat. A voice inside him urged him to come in, to join her, to say hello. After all, he had every right to spend time with his own wife. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the fear of seeing Laurel's face express annoyance at his unexpected appearance, or perhaps he would notice her embarrassment. He didn't want to make a scene in public, and deep down, there was an unpleasant suspicion. What if Laurel was lying about having lunch with her colleagues for work purposes only? Silas walked slowly away from the cafe and leaned his back against the brick wall of the building next door. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. Maybe this was just a friendly lunch, he thought. Colleagues often shared a meal. There was nothing strange about it. He tried to convince himself that the situation was harmless. But the image of Rowan touching Laurel's arm wouldn't leave his mind. A few minutes later, Silas saw the door of the cafe open. Laurel and Dr. Price came out together. They stopped at the entrance, saying goodbye. Rowan smiled at Laurel and said something in parting. She smiled back. Then they parted ways, Rowan heading back toward the clinic and Laurel heading toward the intersection where her car was parked. Silas, trying to avoid her, walked quickly behind the row of parked cars. He felt like a spy, and his own behavior made him uncomfortable. When Laurel disappeared around the corner, he let out a sigh of relief. He didn't want to run into her right now. There were too many questions swirling around his head. The rest of the day passed in a haze for Silas. When he returned to work after lunch, he had little memory of how he had managed the remaining tasks. The scene in the cafeteria kept playing in his mind. He felt as if he had missed something important in Laurel's expression, in her gestures. Perhaps there was more to it than just his colleague's friendliness. Late that evening at home, Silas waited with bated breath for his wife to return. He tried to occupy himself. He heated up dinner, watched the news on TV, but nothing helped to distract himself. Finally, around 8 o'clock, the front door slammed. Laurel was back. "Hello," he responded from the living room, trying to make his voice sound normal. "Hello," she said tiredly, entering the room. She was still wearing her scrubs, with a coat thrown over them. "Sorry, I'm late again today." "It's okay," Silas said softly. "Are you going to have dinner? I heated up a casserole." "A little later, okay. I want to take a shower first," Laurel said, already heading for the bedroom. Silas clenched his fists, alone in the living room. He could feel the tension building inside him. He wanted to ask her right now about lunch with Rowan, about why she was late again. But he was afraid he would do it in the heat of the moment and only ruin everything. Half an hour later, Laurel returned, dressed in her house clothes. She went into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, obviously planning to grab a snack. Silas turned off the TV and followed her. "How was your day?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Fine," Laurel replied, taking out a plate of casserole. "Lots of patience, lots of paperwork. I'm really tired." He nodded, watching her put the plate in the microwave. Making up his mind, he asked, "Did you have lunch with your colleagues today?" Laurel glanced at him briefly. "Yes, with Rowan, our new doctor. You remember I told you about him?" "I remember," he responded as calmly as possible. "How is he, by the way?" She shrugged slightly. "Yes, it's fine. A very smart specialist. Patients love him. We discussed a couple of work issues over lunch." Silas hesitated. He wanted to ask if they had only discussed work matters, but he remained silent. The smiles they had exchanged floated into his mind. However, he did not want to make direct accusations without grounds. "I see," he said only. "I'm glad you have someone to consult with at work." The microwave beeped and Laurel, taking out the hot plate, said quietly, "Yes, it's good when there is support in the team." She passed him with the dinner and went into the living room. Silas remained in the kitchen, feeling even more alone. Nothing obvious had come out of this brief conversation, but the internal alarm bells had grown louder. He knew that his suspicions might be unfounded, and Laurel really had simply found a good friend and colleague. But something in her eyes and tone told him otherwise. He had yet to find out how deeply the truth lay. Within a week, the tension in the Drake household had reached a point where it was impossible to ignore. Laurel was coming home late more and more often, citing delays with patients or impromptu meetings. Silas saw little of her in the evenings. She went straight to the shower and then to bed, avoiding long conversations. They stopped eating dinner together, each eating as they had to. On Friday evening, Laurel said she was going to visit a friend for a couple of hours after work. Silas was wary. "Who is this friend? Do I know her?" he asked, trying to speak casually, although his heart was already beating anxiously in his chest. "You don't know her," Laurel said, pulling on her coat in front of the hall mirror. "She's a colleague of mine, a nurse new. Her name is Kim. We've become a bit of friends, and she invited me to spend the evening with her, to sit and have some wine. She's had a hard day. Ah, I see, he said slowly. Are you staying for long? Laurel glanced at her phone as if checking something. I don't think so. Maybe I'll be back by 10. Don't wait, if anything. She smiled at him in farewell, but there was a hint of worry in her eyes. The door slammed shut, leaving Silas in an empty apartment. At first, he tried to distract himself. He started a movie, tried reading articles on the internet. But as time went on, his anxiety only grew. Thoughts swirled in his head. Why had Laurel never mentioned this Kim before? Why had she decided to go to her house today? And most importantly, would he be able to trust her words after all the strange behavior of the last few weeks? By 10 o'clock, Laurel had still not returned. Silas looked at his phone several times, but there were no messages. He decided to write to himself, "Are you coming soon?" The message remained unread. An hour later, no answer, no call. Anxiety turned to anger and resentment. He imagined her having fun in the company of someone completely oblivious to his worries. Around midnight, his patience snapped. Silas sat on the couch in the dark living room, clutching his phone. An idea came to him that sent a chill down his spine. Check the location of Laurel's phone. He had never invaded her privacy before, finding it unacceptable. But now fear and jealousy overcame principles. A few months ago, at Laurel's request, they had set up Find My Friends on their iPhones, so they could know each other's location in case of an emergency. Silas had never used it since there had been no reason. Now, he opened the app with trembling fingers. The screen showed Laurel's phone at an address Silas didn't recognize. He zoomed in on the map. The location was in a suburban area, about a half hour outside of Milwaukee. A quiet suburban neighborhood, someone else's house. It definitely wasn't Kim's apartment. He didn't remember any friends with that address. His heart pounded so hard he had trouble breathing. Silas stared at the blinking dot on the map for a few minutes. His thoughts were racing. It was well past midnight. He had a wild desire to go there immediately, knock on the door, and see for himself. He even stood up, threw on his jacket, and grabbed his car keys. But when he reached the threshold, he froze. What would he say or do if it turned out that Laurel really was there with another man? Making a scene in someone else's house in the middle of the night was a dubious and humiliating prospect. And there was a lump in his throat, the fear of confirming his worst suspicions. He slowly lowered his hand with the keys. Instead of driving, he did something else. Dialed his wife's number again. Long beeps. No answer. The silence was oppressive. There was a sound. The phone vibrated in his hand. A message from Laurel. "I'm staying the night at Kim's. It's too late to go back, so she offered to stay until the morning." Silas felt both relief and rage as he read those words. Relief because Laurel was physically fine, but rage because he knew it was a lie. The address on the map clearly didn't belong to Kim. He was almost certain he knew where his wife was actually sleeping. Silas had been awake most of the night. He paced the house, sat down, tried to watch TV, and then picked up his phone again, checking to see if Laurel's location had changed. The dot on the screen remained in the same place. During that torturous night, Silas's mind conjured up dozens of images, each worse than the last. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined Laurel in the arms of another man. The thought burned inside him. He tried to brush it off, telling himself he was overthinking it, but the reality kept coming back to him. She had spent the night away from home. In a fit of anger, he even punched the closet door, leaving a dent. Then, coming to his senses, he sank helplessly to the floor. Neither screaming nor crying brought relief. Early in the morning, around 7, the door finally opened and Laurel quietly entered. She tried to tiptoe into the bedroom, hoping to see that her husband was still asleep. But Silas was waiting in the living room, lost in heavy thoughts and insomnia. "Hello," he said hoarsely. Laurel jumped in surprise. "Oh, you're not sleeping." "Hi." She tried to smile, but she was hesitant. "I didn't mean to wake you." "Can't sleep," he said dryly. They stared at each other for a moment. Laurel looked as if she hadn't slept much, with shadows under her eyes and her hair in a messy pile. She was wearing the same clothes she'd worn the night before. Silas felt a twinge of pain. He remembered how she'd once liked to change into cozy pajamas before going to bed at home, and here she was, spending the night God knows where in whatever she had. "How's Kim?" he finally said, putting all his bitterness into the name of his girlfriend. Laurel looked down. With, with Kim, it's fine. She's doing well. I'm glad to hear it. Silas stood up, unable to sit any longer. He was shaking. So you were with Kim all night? Yes, she answered quietly, avoiding his gaze. I wrote to you. I wrote, he nodded. And you know, I'm glad you have such a caring friend who invited you to spend the night. Laurel bit her lip, looking warily at her husband. Silas, what do you want to say? He took a few steps around the room, trying to control his rising anger. I want to say that you came back at 7 in the morning, although you were leaving at 10 at night. That I was restless all night. That you turned off your phone or ignored calls. I explained. Laurel began, but he cut her off. Explained. That she stayed with Kim. He said this almost mockingly. But where does your Kim live? Do you know the address? She was at a loss. The address? Well, on the north side, I think. I don't remember the house number, but we went together. North? Silas's eyebrows shot up. He was barely keeping his voice from screaming. That's funny, because your phone was showing a completely different area. Laurel grumbled, noon. What? I checked your location, he said harshly. Remember when we turned this feature on? Well, yesterday your geolocation was in the suburbs west of the city, not on the north side. And definitely not near the address where your friend Melissa or Jenny, whoever you called Kim, lives. You were following me? Laurel's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with indignation and fear. Her reaction might have confused Silas in another situation, but he was too angry right now. Yes, I did, he snapped. Because you stopped telling me the truth. Who is this man you spent the night with? Laurel paled even more. She was silent for a few seconds, her fingers shaking as she clutched the strap of her bag. It's just a friend, she finally exhaled. Nothing happened, we talked, that's all. I didn't want to go home at night, I was too tired. Friend, Silas repeated, feeling the anger rising in a wave. Do you really think I'm a fool? Do you expect me to believe that a married woman would spend the night with a man's friend for no reason, and not even bother to warn her husband in advance? Stop it, Laurel suddenly shouted loudly, her eyes flashing with anger and tears. You're exaggerating. Nothing terrible happened. Nothing. He smiled bitterly. You lied to me, Laurel. First about some friends, now about just a friend. Do you understand what that looks like? Laurel covered her face with her hands. I didn't cheat on you, she whispered through her fingers. Please believe me. Silas was silent. He suddenly realized that he was afraid to hear the truth, but he could not believe her words. He wanted to scream, to punch the wall in despair, but he stood motionless, only his heavy breathing betraying the storm inside. There was a long silence. Finally, Laurel dropped her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. Maybe we should talk about this with a mediator, she suggested quietly. I feel like we can't do it on our own. This is all snowballing. What are you talking about now? Silas frowned, although he guessed. About a family psychologist, Laurel breathed out. About consultations. We need help to figure this out. Silas took a step back, stunned. He had expected shouting, excuses, more lies, but not this. Laurel's offer meant she was acknowledging the problem, but still not telling the whole truth. You want to see a therapist? He asked incredulously. Yes, she answered, her voice shaking. If you agree, please. Silas stared at her for a few seconds. Here stood the woman he had loved for so many years, and now she seemed like a stranger, scared, unhappy, caught in a lie. He ran his hand over his face, trying to make up his mind. He wanted answers, but there were none. Maybe therapy really could bring the truth out. Okay, he said quietly at last. Let's try, but Laurel. He trailed off, fighting the pain that was building. If you keep lying to me, it won't save us. She nodded, looking down. I understand. So, in the morning half-light of their kitchen, a strange and bitter decision was made to seek help from a family psychologist, instead of finally destroying what was left of their trust in each other. A few days after the morning's argument, Laurel was able to book them an appointment with a couples therapist. They were scheduled for Tuesday evening with a counselor named Nora Hale, an experienced therapist recommended by Laurel's colleague. Silas didn't mind, although he was torn between the two of him. How could a stranger help them if Laurel was so determined to hide the truth? On Tuesday after work, they drove together. Silas had spent the morning at the office barely concentrating, his mind racing with possible conversation scenarios. He was angry, worried, hopeful, and afraid all at once. Laurel looked tense too as they got into the car. They usually chatted or listened to music on the way, but now they drove in silence. The family psychologist office was located in the city center in an old brick building. Nora herself met them in the reception area, a woman of about 50 with a friendly smile and a calm voice. She invited the couple to go into a cozy room with soft lighting. The three of them sat down, Silas and Laurel on a small sofa next to each other, Nora in an armchair opposite. So, what brought you to me? The psychologist began quietly, looking from one to the other. Silas felt Laurel tense, slightly beside him. There was a pause. Nora repeated softly, "Who would like to start?" Laurel swallowed and spoke first. "We're having troubles in our relationship," she said quietly. "We've been drifting apart for the last few months. Misunderstandings, resentments." She glanced at her husband as if asking permission to continue. Silas nodded silently, his hands clasped in his lap. "I see," Nora continued to ask in an attentive tone. "Can you give me a recent example that illustrates this misunderstanding?" Laurel nervously adjusted a strand of hair. "Well, there was a fight recently. Silas, she hesitated, not knowing how to formulate it. "We argued about me staying out late." Nora turned her gaze to Silas. "Silas, would you like to describe from your side what happened?" He cleared his throat. It was strange and unpleasant to talk about this to a stranger, but for the sake of the process, he forced himself to. "Laurel didn't come home last night," he said dryly. "She told me about it almost midnight. I was worried, so I tried to call. In the end, it turned out she was staying with friends I knew nothing about. It shocked me." Nora nodded. "I understand. Did you feel disturbed and perhaps deceived?" "Yes," Silas confirmed firmly. He wanted to add more about suspecting her of lying, but he held back. "And you, Laurel," the therapist continued, "what did you feel in that situation? Why did you decide to stay away from home without consulting your husband?" Laurel looked down at her hands in her lap. "I didn't think it was such a problem," she said hesitantly. "My friend was in trouble. She really needed to talk. I decided to support her, and it was late to go home, so I stayed with her. I really didn't want to worry Silas, and honestly, I didn't expect him to react like that." Silas felt the indignation boiling up in his chest again at the lie, but he only clenched his jaw, letting Nora do the talking. "I see," Nora said softly. "I mean, Laurel, you didn't see anything wrong with what you did, but for Silas, it was a painful blow to his trust. Am I right in summing that up?" Laurel nodded, and Silas, after a moment's hesitation, did the same. Nora continued, "Then let's talk about trust. How would you both rate the level of trust in your marriage before this situation?" "I used to trust her completely," Silas answered immediately, not missing the opportunity. "In 8 years of marriage, we have never had a moment where we doubted each other." Laurel added quietly, "It's true. We've always been honest with each other. Until recently." The therapist tilted her head slightly. "What has changed recently?" Silence again. Silas saw that Laurel was struggling to find the words. She was speaking in generalities, not getting to the point. He decided to intervene. "After my major surgery, we started having problems," he said, "physically and emotionally. I think that was the beginning of distance." Nora listened intently. Tell me more, if possible. Silas shrugged. I had spinal surgery 6 months ago. The recovery was long and difficult. During that period, our intimate life, and in general, our leisure time together were reduced to a minimum. I was bedridden at first, irritable. Laurel helped me a lot, but it probably wasn't easy for her. Laurel sat motionless next to him, her eyes downcast. Yes, it wasn't easy, she confirmed barely audibly. I was very worried about him. I tried to be strong, to support him. And how are things now intimately, if I may ask? Nora asked cautiously. Silas felt awkward, but answered honestly. The last few months, nothing. There is almost no intimacy. After my physical recovery, we never managed to return to our previous rhythm. I don't know why. It was hard for him to admit it. Laurel just nodded in confirmation. Nora was silent for a moment and then asked Laurel, how do you feel about this? Laurel fidgeted nervously with the hem of her skirt. I felt lonely, I guess, she said after a while. I know Silas had his reasons, pain, stress, but I guess I lacked attention, not just physically, but in general. Warmth, I guess. The words stung Silas. He realized that this was the first time he had heard her admit such a thing. She had never spoken of her dissatisfaction before. I'm sorry, he said quietly, sincerely. I was probably too caught up in my own problems. I didn't mean to distance myself. Laurel turned to face him, and for a moment there was a look of longing in her eyes. I know, and I didn't want it either, but it turned out the way it did, Nora remarked softly. Sometimes, when a couple experiences a gap like this, a lack of intimacy, communication, people start looking for comfort elsewhere. Laurel, have you thought about this? Or maybe trying to fill the void with something outside of marriage? The direct question hung in the air. Silas held his breath, looking at his wife. Laurel flushed. No, she answered too quickly. No, nothing like that. I just withdrew into myself, that's all. Nora narrowed her eyes slightly, but didn't press. She changed the subject, talking about how they could reconnect emotionally. She advised them to spend time walking together, talking, being open. At one of these sessions, in a spacious office with the usual soft light, Nora asked, Silas, how do you look at what happened now? Have your feelings for Laurel changed during this time? He paused, choosing his words. Before, right after the betrayal, I felt only rage and pain. I wanted to erase her from my memory, he admitted. Now, I don't know. I still wake up sometimes and think about her. But I'm not as angry as I used to be. Nora nodded. What comes instead of anger? Silas sighed. Sadness, I guess. And also, honestly, sometimes guilt. I've thought a lot. I understand what I did wrong during our marriage. After the surgery, I distanced myself from Laurel, withdrew into myself. Maybe if I'd been more considerate of her feelings, this wouldn't have happened. Nora frowned softly. Do you consider yourself guilty of her betrayal? Not guilty, he said slowly, looking at the pattern of the carpet under his feet. Her choice is on her conscience, but I see my share of responsibility. Marriage is too, and ours, apparently, has cracked on both sides. The words came hard to him, but saying them out loud brought a strange sense of relief. Nora looked at him intently. Realizing your mistakes is an important step. The main thing is not to confuse this with justifying someone else's bad behavior. You can admit that something went wrong, but at the same time not relieve her of responsibility for the choice. I understand, Silas nodded. I guess I'm starting to forgive her. This confession sounded quiet but clear. Nora smiled slightly. Forgiveness is often needed not so much by the one who is forgiven, but by the one who forgives. It frees one from a burden. Silas actually felt the load gradually becoming lighter. Of course, there was no question of Laurel confessing on that first visit to Nora. She denied having consolation elsewhere. However, after the session, Silas detected anxiety in her behavior. Apparently, the psychologist's direct question had struck a chord with Laurel. After saying their goodbyes, the couple left the office. They were silent in the car. Laurel looked exhausted, tears in her eyes, although she tried to hold on. Silas drove, staring straight ahead. He felt betrayed again. Even in front of the therapist, Laurel did not dare tell the truth. At home, before going to bed, they exchanged only a few words. The night passed coldly and distantly. Silas tossed and turned on the edge of the bed, and Laurel cried quietly, turned to the wall. They both knew that this could not go on, but neither dared to say the decisive words. 2 nights after his first appointment with the therapist, Silas lay awake. Laurel was breathing quietly on the bed next to him. Their relationship was hanging by a thread. They barely spoke during the day. Every word was labored. It seemed as if there was a wall of unsaid things between them. The clock hands showed almost 2 in the morning. Silas stared at the ceiling in the darkness when he heard a quiet vibrating sound. Laurel's phone lit up on the nightstand. She had not moved, apparently fast asleep after crying all night. Silas remembered how they used to trust each other enough to take each other's phone to look at photos or make calls. Now he felt almost like a criminal, reaching for her phone. But his heart was pounding. What if this message was from him? The screen showed a notification, a message from Rowan. Silas froze. There was no doubt left this was the same Rowan Price. He touched the screen with a trembling finger, and the message opened on the locked phone, showing the first line. I can't sleep. I'm thinking about you. T. The text then broke off, demanding to be unlocked. Silas felt heat flare up in his chest. He glanced back at Laurel, who was still asleep, curled up under the covers. She must not have heard the vibration. He typed in a 4-digit code. He knew at random her birthday. The screen unlocked. Silas's heart skipped a beat. Laurel hadn't changed her password, trusting him not to try. Irony. The full text of the message jumped before my eyes. Can't sleep. Thinking about you. That night was magical. I miss you so much. Hope to see you soon. Silas read these lines once, twice, as if he could not believe his own eyes. His hands grew cold, his breathing became rapid and shallow. He opened the entire correspondence. Lines of dialogue, dozens of messages, someone else's intimate life, hidden behind her back, unfolded before him. Here Laurel writes, After our meeting, I keep thinking about you. Today at work, when you came in, my heart was jumping. Here's Rowan's response. You're amazing. I barely resisted the urge to touch you when I passed by. I can't wait to hold you again. Silas skimmed through the conversation, his eyes darting feverishly. They texted each other almost every day. They joked, they supported each other. But most importantly, there were clear hints of physical intimacy. I can still feel your lips on mine. Rowan wrote. It felt good for me too. You're so gentle, Laurel replied. The latest messages were from this evening. How are you? Holding up? I'm sorry you're going through this. I'm here for you, Rowan wrote, apparently referring to therapy or their marital problems. Laurel replied, It's hard. I can't talk yet. I'll tell you later. Thank you for being there. Silas clenched his teeth. This was the confirmation he had both dreaded and craved. The affair, the betrayal, it was all a fact. Something inside him seemed to snap. For several minutes, he simply sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the screen. His hands were shaking. Pain, anger, humiliation all mixed into a cocktail that made his head spin. Laurel stirred, perhaps feeling the mattress shift. Silas stood up. His heart was pounding in his throat, his palms were a little sweaty, but there was a frightening determination in his movements now. He turned on the lamp next to the bed. Soft light filled the room. Laurel squinted, waking up at the sudden light. Silas, what happened? She whispered sleepily, sitting up and covering herself with a blanket from the bright light. Instead of answering, he handed her her phone number. Read it. His voice sounded hoarse and rough. Laurel looked at the screen sleepily, not yet understanding what was happening. For a few seconds, she saw no connection. Then her eyes widened. She grabbed the phone with a jerk. For a few seconds, she frantically scanned the open messages. The words swam before her eyes, but the meaning was enough to change her pallor to a deathly white. Her face instantly paled. I. She began haltingly, raising her frightened eyes to her husband. Silas felt a flash of anger. It's all written here in black and white. You slept together. You lied to my face for weeks. Laurel trembled, tears instantly welling up in her eyes. I'm sorry. Please, I'll explain everything. Explain? Silas began to shout, though he tried to restrain himself. What is there to explain, Laurel? How long has this been going on? A month? 2? He almost shouted the last words. 3 months. She answered barely audibly, lowering her head. 3 months. Silas laughed bitterly, a short, joyless laugh. You've been betraying me for 3 months. Oh my God. He stepped back, feeling like he couldn't look at her. Was it from the very beginning, when you started staying late? All these girlfriends, work, is it all with him? Laurel sobbed. Yes, she whispered. Forgive me, Silas. Forgive me. His voice broke. How could you? We have a family, a marriage. Laurel, sobbing, tried to get closer to him, to grab his hand. Silas, please listen. I'm so sorry. It happened. I didn't mean to hurt you. He pulled his hand back as if her touch had burned him. Don't touch me, please. I want to understand one thing. Why? Do I deserve this? What did you lack, Laurel? His voice trembled with despair and anger. Laurel covered her face with her hands. I don't know. It all got out of control. She tried to speak through her sobs. I was lonely. After your surgery, you became distant. We were almost not close. I felt unwanted, unnecessary. And Rowan, he just supported, listened. It somehow went beyond the boundaries. But it was a mistake. It was only physical, you understand. Only sex because I so lacked closeness and warmth. I don't love him. I've always loved only you. Silas stared at her, not believing his ears. Her words seemed to hit him. Only physically. He wanted to scream that this was no excuse, but he couldn't squeeze out the words right away. His throat felt like it was constricted. Finally, he whispered, lowering his voice to a dangerous quiet. Just physically. You slept with him just because you weren't having enough sex. Laurel took her hands away from her face. Yes, I mean no. She continued haltingly, it sounds terrible, I know. But I wasn't looking for love on the side, it was. A need to feel wanted, needed. After all these months, when you were recovering, I tried to be strong, but there was an emptiness growing inside me, and he was there at the right moment. Enough, Silas cut her off wearily. Just enough. You're trying to justify it even now. Do you think that because you didn't fall in love with him, but were just relieving stress, that it's any less of a betrayal? You slept with another man, Laurel. More than once, I understand. She shook her head, whispering. Several times. But I broke it off, really. Even before the therapy, I told him that this couldn't go on any longer. This detail sparked a new fire in Silas's mind. Did you stop yourself? When? Why? A few days ago. She answered through tears. I couldn't do it anymore. I was consumed with guilt. After you found out about that night, I lied about my friend. I realized there was no point in lying anymore. I told Rowan that it was over between us, that I was trying to save the marriage. Silas listened, stunned. So the affair was effectively over, but too late the damage had been done. He felt his strength draining away. He sank into a chair near the dressing table, covering his face with his hands. For a while, all that could be heard was Laurel's sobbing. If you stopped everything, why didn't you confess to me yourself? He asked dully through his fingers. Why did I have to tear this truth out with pliers? I was afraid. She answered, her voice breaking. I was afraid of losing you forever. I thought that if I told you, you would leave me. And I wanted to fix everything, really. I hoped that through therapy we could mend our relationship, and you would never know about my misdeed. It's stupid, I know. Silas lowered his hands and looked up at her. He saw a broken person before him, her shoulders shaking, her face flooded with tears. But he felt no compassion. Inside him, anger and deep resentment still burned. Were you hoping to hide this and just move on as if nothing had happened? He asked with a bitter smile. A very mature decision. Laurel reached out to him again. Please, Silas, I love you. We've been through so much together. Don't break everything completely, I beg you. I'm ready to do anything to make you forgive me. We can handle it. It will never happen again, I swear. He rose from his chair, stepping back, and raised his hand, stopping the flow of her pleas. Stop it. Do you really think you can go back after this? As if nothing happened? His voice broke. I can't. I can't look at you and not see. His hands on you, your correspondence. His voice failed him. He pressed his fists to his temples, trying to push away the images his imagination involuntarily drew. Laurel sobbed, repeating, "It was a disgusting act. It's my fault. But people make mistakes. We can try to start over. I'll do whatever you say. Just don't leave." Silas realized with bitterness that even now, watching her suffer, he did not feel the slightest confidence that he could forgive. His trust was destroyed. He feared that even if he stayed, he would be tormented for the rest of his life by suspicion, disgust, and pain. He straightened up, trying to speak evenly. "No, Laurel, it's too late. I can't forget or forgive this." He sighed shakily. "I'm filing for divorce." The words seemed to hang in the silence, deafening them both. Laurel shook her head. "No. Don't say that. Don't rush, please. Give me a chance. Give us a chance." Silas felt tears welling up in his eyes too, but he forced them down. Too much had been cried before, and now all that was left was emptiness. "There were chances," he said quietly. "When I asked, I begged you to be honest. You chose to lie. And more than that, you betrayed us. There is no more us, Laurel. You destroyed everything." She covered her face with her hands and burst into tears, knowing that she was losing him completely. Silas didn't try to comfort her. He stood there, unsure of what to do next. Part of him wanted to run out of the house right then. Part of him wanted to collapse on the floor and start crying too. But instead, he walked slowly towards the bedroom door. "Where are you going?" Laurel sobbed, dropping her hands. "Away from you," he answered dully. "I'll spend the night in the living room. And in the morning, we'll sort out the paperwork. I'll find a lawyer." Silas, no. She tried to get up, but he had already left, closing the door behind him. The living room was dark and quiet. Silas sank down on the sofa, just as he was, in a t-shirt and sweatpants. He stared at one point in front of him. His soul seemed to have turned to stone. "It's all over," he repeated in his head, and with these thoughts, in the early twilight, he met the dawn without closing his eyes. The morning after the breakup was cold and gray. Silas met the dawn on the living room couch, still wide awake. His head was pounding from lack of sleep and the shock of the experience. The bedroom was silent. Laurel had probably barely slept either after the previous night's scene. Around 8 o'clock, the bedroom door opened quietly. Laurel came out, dressed in jeans and a sweater, her eyes red from crying. She was holding a duffel bag full of clothes. Silas looked at her with a tired, empty gaze. He didn't feel like saying anything. I guess I'll go," she said quietly. Her voice was hoarse from crying. "I'll stay with a friend for now." Silas nodded silently. He sat with his hands between his knees, staring at the floor. Laurel took a hesitant step closer. "I'm so sorry," she began, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "Not now," he said dully. He didn't have the strength to look up at her. Everything inside him was boiling with pain again. "Just go away." Laurel froze, then let out a soft sob. "I'll call later to discuss what to do next." "I'll get a lawyer," Silas interrupted, his tone equally colorless. "You should get a lawyer too. We'll talk through them." He heard her inhale sharply, but Laurel didn't argue. She just whispered, "Understood." A minute later, the front door slammed, leaving Silas alone in the empty apartment. That same day, around midday, Silas sat in the office of a family lawyer. The space seemed unreal, a strict office with shelves of files, the city roaring outside the window. The lawyer, a distinguished man in his 40s, listened attentively to his client's confused story. "I want a divorce as soon as possible," Silas concluded, meeting the lawyer's gaze. Silas's own eyes were red with fatigue, but his determination was firm. The lawyer sighed. I understand your situation, Mr. Drake. Unfortunately, in our state of Wisconsin, there is a mandatory waiting period of 120 days from the date of filing before a divorce is finalized, even if both parties agree. 4 months. Silas said quietly, clenching his fingers. He couldn't bear to think that this would drag on for that long. Yes, but we can submit the documents immediately, today or tomorrow, the lawyer continued in a professional tone. In your situation, as I understand it, there are no children, and probably you will be able to resolve the issue of division of property amicably. I hope so, Silas answered sullenly. We have a house, the mortgage is almost paid off, a car, savings together. I don't want any scandals. I don't think she'll make things difficult either. The words came hard. It was painful to call her in a detached, businesslike manner, but Silas could not help it. The emotions were too fresh. Good. If the spouse agrees, you can draw up a property division agreement voluntarily, the lawyer nodded. This will speed up the process and save you from unnecessary litigation. You will need to discuss with her who takes what, or put the house up for sale and divide the proceeds. I suppose I'll have to sell it, Silas muttered. The house they'd built together now seemed like a strange place, full of ghosts from the past. I don't want to stay here. The lawyer looked at him with understanding. I understand. I will prepare a divorce petition. You can give a copy to your spouse in person or via courier. After filing, the 120-day countdown will begin. During this time, it is advisable for you and her to enter into a settlement agreement on the division of property. Then the final court hearing will be purely a formality. Silas nodded. The lawyer continued asking clarifying questions, dates, facts. When the conversation turned to the reasons for the divorce, the lawyer asked, Do you want to state the reason in the lawsuit? In our state, this is not required. Irreconcilable differences are enough. But if there was a fact of betrayal, sometimes clients insist on indicating a moral reason, although this has no legal effect. Silas clenched his jaw, remembering the previous night. No, he exhaled. I don't want to air dirty laundry in public. Just disagreements. He couldn't say betrayal out loud. The word alone brought bitterness, and the understanding that it wouldn't change anything won out over the desire to write the truth in documents. Silas felt empty as he left the lawyer's office. The cold November wind blew outside. He turned up the collar of his coat and headed for the car. Now he had to tell Laurel his decision if she hadn't already figured it out. However, by evening a message came from her. I found a lawyer. I am ready to discuss the terms when you are ready. We can talk on the phone or in person, as you say. The polite, formal tone cut to the heart. Once they shared everything with each other, and now they communicate like strangers. Silas did not answer immediately. Only late in the evening, having gathered his courage, he wrote, Better in the presence of lawyers. I am filing documents tomorrow. The answer came almost immediately. I understand. He stared at the screen. He wanted to write something else, like ask where she lived now, if everything was okay. But he erased the phrases he had typed. It was no longer his business. Alone in the empty house, Silas realized for the first time how quiet it was. Every room reminded him of Laurel, her favorite scarf on a hook, her half-empty bottle of shampoo in the bathroom. On the shelf by the mirror was a wedding photograph of them laughing at each other. Silas walked over and picked up the frame. His heart ached. He carefully placed the picture face down in the dresser drawer. Not now, maybe never. That night he barely slept again. This time not from rage, but from a sharp wave of grief. The realization that their life together was effectively overcome full force. Silas lay on the empty marital bed and finally began to cry, burying his face in the pillow that he had shared with his beloved wife only yesterday. Later in the evening, Silas's phone vibrated. It was Mark, his friend and colleague. Silas didn't want to talk to anyone, but after a pause, he answered. Mark invited him to have a beer and watch baseball, But Silas, with difficulty managing to sound more or less cheerful, declined, citing business. His friend noticed that his voice was not very good, but Silas assured him that everything was fine and they would write later. He pressed end call, dropped the phone on the couch next to him, and covered his face with his hands. He didn't have the strength to tell anyone about what had happened yet. He woke up in the morning feeling broken, but determined to move forward. He had to get through this day, and then the next, and so on until the pain began to subside. He hoped that someday it would. A week after the divorce papers were filed, Laurel was supposed to come home to collect her remaining things. They had arranged it over the phone, in a voice that was unfamiliar and formally polite. Silas had wisely chosen the time during the day on Saturday, when he didn't have to rush to work. He was tormented by the thought of the upcoming meeting, but it was impossible to avoid it. Too many of Laurel's things were left in the house. On Saturday at noon, the doorbell rang. Silas, who had unlocked the door, let her in. Laurel looked pale and haggard. She stepped timidly across the threshold, as if she were a guest in her own home. "Hello," she said quietly. "Hello," he said dryly. "Come in." They walked into the living room in silence. Laurel set the empty boxes she had brought to pack on the floor. They stood there for a few tense seconds, unsure of where to begin. Finally, Silas broke the silence. How did you want to do it? Help me with something." Laurel flinched at the unexpected question. "I think I'll pack my own clothes, books." She looked around. "Maybe some little things. Our shared things we can decide together who gets what." "Okay," he nodded. "I can go through the list of assets my lawyer has prepared, and we'll distribute it." She glanced at him. "Go ahead. I agree with any reasonable suggestions you make." Silas pulled a printed list from the coffee table: furniture, appliances, car, bank accounts. Seeing Laurel standing there, uncomfortably, he gestured to a chair. He sat down on the sofa opposite her, resting the list on his knee. "So," he began in a businesslike voice, trying not to look directly at her, "I propose that you leave the car to me. It is registered in my name, and I will pay the remainder of the loan. As compensation, you will get a larger share of the sale of the house or cash, whichever is more convenient." "Okay," Laurel agreed quietly. The car didn't seem to bother her much right now. "The house, I think we've decided to sell," Silas continued, clearing his throat. The words stuck in his throat when he thought they were discussing dividing up their nest as property. "The realtor already looked at it, said we can put it on the market. We'll split the proceeds." "Yes, that would be right." Laurel lowered her eyes. "The savings in the bank are also divided in half." He ran his finger along the items. "We have about 20,000 there. We can simply divide it, or if you want, part of it will go to closing the mortgage before selling the house. That's also divided in half, actually." "I'll agree to half of everything," she replied, shrugging slightly. "I don't have any special demands." Silas nodded, feeling both relief at her compliance and bitterness at the situation. They spoke in dry phrases, like business partners ending an unsuccessful partnership. "Furniture." He looked around the living room. "I don't know if it makes sense to divide it. Most of it can be left in the house until the sale. It's easier to sell it furnished. And then we can either agree to sell it to the buyer or sell it separately." "I suppose it's better that way," Laurel agreed. "I don't have much to do with it now. I'm renting a small room from a friend. There's no room for furniture." Silas looked up at his wife for the first time. "Who are you now?" "You said at a friend's." Laurel adjusted a strand of hair. "Yes, remember, the nurse from the clinic, Melanie. You don't know her. She let me stay temporarily." She hesitated. "I plan to find something of my own later, an apartment, when everything is sorted out." "I see," was all he said, looking back down at the list. He had an urge to ask if Rowan had helped her with her lodgings, but he suppressed it. It didn't matter now. They continued listing things. The discussion was surprisingly calm. No arguments, no complaints. Laurel only indifferently refused trifles, offering to leave many things with Silas or throw them away if he did not need them. Several times he reminded her that this was her money and things too, and that she was entitled to half. But Laurel only shook her head. I don't need much. Whatever you say, so it will be. An hour later, the main issues were resolved. There was a heavy pause. Laurel stood up. Thank you for not making a scene, she said quietly. I know you don't have to be gentle with me. Silas rubbed the bridge of his nose wearily. It can't get any worse, he said honestly. I just want to get it over with quickly. Laurel nodded, looking down. I understand. Then she went to the bedroom to gather her personal belongings. Silas was left alone in the living room, trying to contain the avalanche of emotions. Their discussion, surprisingly civilized, had nevertheless knocked the wind out from under him. It was too painful to separate what had once united them. He heard muffled sounds from the bedroom drawers opening, wrapping paper rustling. He couldn't stand it any longer, stood up and peered in for a moment. Laurel was putting a stack of her favorite books from the bedside shelf into a box. She froze when she saw him. Their eyes met. For a moment, there was a silent understanding in the silence. This was how their old life was ending. Laurel opened her mouth as if to say something, perhaps to say goodbye. But Silas, feeling a lump in his throat, pressed his lips together and looked away. Go on, he said dully and stepped back, closing the bedroom door behind him. At one point, while collecting books from the shelf, Laurel discovered a small seashell between the volumes. She picked it up, recognizing it as a souvenir from their long-ago trip to the ocean. Silas noticed the find too and froze for a moment. They both remembered that day on the beach, the sound of the surf, the happy laughter. The shell held an echo of that past. Laurel hesitated a moment, then handed the shell to him. Take it if you want. Her voice broke. Silas carefully took the trophy from her palm. Their fingers touched for a second. He nodded. Thank you. They said nothing more, but that silent scene said a lot. Each of them silently said goodbye to another fragment of their love. Another half-hour later, Laurel came out carrying 2 boxes and a bag. Silas volunteered to help carry them to the car. Together, they went down to the car parked near the house and loaded the things. It was time to say goodbye. Laurel nervously fiddled with the keys in her hands. If you need anything, my signature or anything, let me know, she said quietly. Okay, he replied. He didn't look up, but looked at the crack in the asphalt under his feet. Take care of yourself, okay? She added quietly after a pause. Silas felt his insides clench at the familiar tone carrying, once dear. But he only nodded. Laurel hesitated a moment longer, as if hoping for an answer. When she got none, she opened the car door and got in. The engine started. Silas stepped back onto the sidewalk. The car pulled away slowly from the house and soon disappeared around the corner. He sighed heavily and looked up at the windows of the empty house. For the first time in his life, the house was no longer a home. It was just real estate that would have to be sold. And ahead was a new, unknown life without Laurel. In early spring, after 4 long months, the divorce was finalized. On the appointed day, Silas and Laurel met briefly in the Milwaukee County courtroom. The proceedings took 10 minutes, perhaps. They sat side by side in the empty courtroom, but it was as if they were on opposite sides of the world. The judge glanced over their property settlement and asked a few formal questions. Neither Silas nor Laurel showed any emotion. He merely noted that her wedding ring was no longer on her hand, nor was his. In the eyes of the law, their marriage was over. When the judge said, "The marriage is dissolved," Silas felt a strange thrill, the official point seeming to echo somewhere in his chest. He glanced sideways at Laurel, who was looking down at her hands folded in her lap, her face impassive, only her white knuckles betraying the tension. The April sun was shining outside when they left the courthouse. Laurel paused on the steps, looking away. Silas paused, too, unsure of what to say. He wanted to say at least a formal good luck or take care, but the words stuck in his throat. Well, Laurel began quietly, her gaze sliding over him. That's all. Yes, he responded almost in a whisper. His heart sank, realizing the finality of these simple words. She nodded, clutching a folder with copies of documents to her chest. Then, goodbye, Silas. He just bowed his head, silent. Laurel turned slowly and walked away down the path, disappearing into the crowd of people walking past the courthouse. Silas watched her for a few moments, then looked down. He felt drained, as if he had lost all his strength in those minutes. But there was still work to do. A couple of weeks after the divorce, the house was sold. A buyer was found quickly. The cozy family home did not stay on the market for long. On the last evening before handing over the keys, Silas came there to collect the rest of his things. The house was already empty. The furniture had been taken out. The rooms gaped like an echo. He walked through the silent rooms, checking to make sure he hadn't forgotten anything. The living room where he and Laurel had once had movie nights, cuddling on the couch. The kitchen where she had cooked him breakfast on weekends, humming to herself. The bedroom where they had shared joys and sorrows for almost 8 years. All of that was in the past now. Silas paused in the doorway of the empty bedroom. He remembered the first day they had moved into this house, young and happy, with dizzying plans for the future. They laughed then, sprawled on the floor among cardboard boxes, dreaming of how they would arrange each room. A memory blinding in contrast. Now the room was empty, and their dreams were shattered. He took a deep breath, clutching a box with his last belongings in his hands, a couple of books, a folder with documents, a few souvenirs. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he had no strength to cry. It seemed he had cried it all out back then in the winter. Goodbye. Silas whispered into the silence with just his lips, not quite understanding who he was addressing: his home, his memories, or his departed love. An hour later, he handed the keys over to the new owner and left. Now he was starting a new life in a rented apartment closer to the city center, modest and still alien, but his own in a new stage. A colleague at work, Mark, helped move the things. He also insisted on celebrating the housewarming with a symbolic glass of beer. In the evening, among the boxes that had not yet been unpacked, Mark handed Silas a bottle. "Here's to new beginnings, my friend. You can do it," he said confidently, clinking the bottles lightly. Silas smiled faintly. "To a new chapter," he repeated quietly, taking a sip. Mark sat down on the armrest of an old chair, looking around the empty room. "If anything happens, call me. You know, all the guys at work are worried about you. You're a good person. Don't disappear." "Thank you, Mark," Silas responded, touched by the concern. "I'm really lucky with my colleagues." They chatted a little more about trivialities: work, local news. Mark tried to distract his friend, avoiding the topic of divorce. An hour later, he took his leave, promising to stop by on the weekend. When Mark left, Silas was left alone among the quiet walls of his new home. The silence was heavy on his ears, but not as oppressive as in the empty old house. Everything was different here, without the ghosts of the past around every corner. He sat down on the mattress, the bed thrown right on the floor. He had not yet managed to assemble, and for the first time in a long time he felt something like relief. Yes, there was loneliness and uncertainty ahead, but the worst was behind him. The period had been set. The pain did not go away completely, but it gradually dulled, turning into a quiet sadness. That night, before he went to bed, Silas opened his laptop and jotted down a list of goals, little things he wanted to do now that nothing was holding him back. The list was simple: sign up for a gym again after the surgery he'd given up on, dig his dusty guitar out of storage and remember a few tunes, meet up with an old friend from college. Something had to fill the void. He spent the night in his new place restlessly, waking up several times, but without any terrible nightmares. And in the morning, opening his eyes and remembering that a completely different day lay ahead without Laurel, he felt both sadness and a vague hope. Somewhere deep inside, there was a thought that perhaps, with time, everything would get better. Laurel felt the consequences of her choice no less painfully. After the conversation with Rowan in the park, when she put an end to their relationship, there followed long days and weeks of reflection and self-flagellation. The grief of losing her husband was superimposed on a sharp sense of guilt that seemed impossible to assuage. At first, Laurel lived as if on autopilot, to work in the morning, back to her small rented apartment in the evening. Her appetite was gone, her sleep was restless. She avoided communicating with colleagues more than necessary and spent her free time alone. The world narrowed to the route home, clinic, and back. However, one evening, returning to an empty apartment and helplessly falling onto the sofa, she suddenly realized, this can't go on. If she doesn't try to get out of this hole, she will simply lose herself completely. The next day, trembling with excitement, Laurel dialed the number of a psychologist recommended by the same Nora Hale. Nora couldn't see her personally because of a conflict of interest, but recommended a colleague. Thus began a new chapter, the chapter of working on herself. At her very first individual session, Laurel burst into tears, telling a strange female psychologist about how she had betrayed the man she loved, how she had destroyed the good things she had. The therapist listened attentively and without judgment. Gradually, meeting after meeting, Laurel learned to forgive herself a difficult task. The psychologist helped her understand not only the fact of betrayal, but also the underlying reasons. Laurel confessed to her how it all began. First, innocent tea parties during a break with Dr. Price, discussing patients, sharing jokes. She was flattered by her colleague's attention, especially when the house was cool. One day after work, he offered to give her a ride, and they lingered in the car talking. Then there was a kiss that Laurel immediately regretted. But then there was more. Secret meetings, short moments of passion mixed with her tears and pleas for herself to stop. The psychologist helped her see that the affair was an attempt to fill an emotional void, albeit a misguided and destructive one. Gradually, in sessions, they explored why Laurel had not talked to her husband about her needs, why she had chosen to run away from the problem instead of having an honest conversation. As the months passed, Laurel began to slowly come back to life. She tried to take better care of herself. She began running in the mornings along the Milwaukee River, releasing her tension into movement. After her runs, she felt a little freer from the weight of her thoughts. Laurel also found support from her friend Melanie, the same nurse colleague with whom she temporarily lived immediately after leaving Silas. Melanie knew about the betrayal only in general terms. Laurel was too ashamed to reveal all the details, but she sincerely wanted to help. Once a week, they went out somewhere to sit in a cafe with a cup of latte or walk around the mall. At first, Laurel went out in public with effort through force, but Melanie knew how to distract her with conversations about work, about plans for vacation, about some new TV series. These ordinary girlish conversations allowed Laurel to forget for a while. One such evening, sitting in a coffee shop, Melanie asked cautiously, "Have you thought about changing jobs? It's hard for you where every corner reminds you of, and you see Rowan all the time." Laurel stirred her cooling coffee with a spoon. "Yes, I did," she answered honestly. "At first I wanted to quit right after the divorce. But you know, money, uncertainty. I'll hold on for now." She looked down. The clinic was indeed a reminder of the past, from the office where she had first met Rowan and where the months of tortured lies had taken place. And although Rowan had not tried to rekindle the relationship and had kept a respectful distance, his very presence was a painful sting. Melanie nodded sympathetically. "I understand, but what about now? Maybe it's time for a change." "You know, I guess so," Laurel sighed. "I heard there's an opening at the rehab center next door, literally across the street. Maybe I'll try it. New place, new start." "That's a clever girl," Melanie touched her hand encouragingly. "You're a great specialist. You need to develop and not dwell on the past." Laurel soon did just that. In early fall, she transferred to work at another medical center. The team greeted her warmly, and her work was going well. Around the same time, she learned that Dr. Price had soon left their previous clinic and moved to work in another city. Fate had separated them completely, which Laurel was even glad about. The fresh environment was good for her, no longer seeing the same walls and faces every day. She noticed that she thought less about her mistakes and focused more on the present. By this time, she had already received her share of the sale of the house and was able to afford to rent a larger apartment, a small, bright studio closer to work. In furnishing her new home, Laurel deliberately took nothing from her past life. She bought new bedding, curtains, even dishes, everything to start with a clean slate. Only a few favorite books and a couple of framed photographs of her parents moved with her. She did not take a single picture of Silas. She kept them in a box hidden deep in the closet until she was ready to look at them without pain. Gradually, those around her began to notice the changes in her. Laurel's gaze was no longer permanently dull. She smiled at her patients again, genuinely participating in their successes on the path to recovery. The work that had previously turned into torture began to bring satisfaction again. Of course, this path was not easy. Sometimes at night, Laurel would be overcome by a wave of melancholy. She would sob into her pillow, whispering apologies and words of love into the void, addressed to someone who was no longer there. At such moments, she clearly understood what she had lost through her stupidity. But during the day, she got up and lived on for herself, for at least the opportunity to someday atone for her mistake with good deeds or simply become a better version of herself. Deep down, Laurel didn't expect miracles. She didn't hope to bring back the past. Instead, she tried to accept the idea that the only thing she could do was learn. She vowed to herself that if fate gave her another chance at love, she would never again go against her conscience, but would speak and listen as she had failed to do then. Sometimes Laurel thought about writing Silas a letter, a long apology, an explanation, a plea for forgiveness. She even jotted down a draft one night when she was overwhelmed. But the next morning, when she reread what she had written, she knew she couldn't do it. These words would not bring back what had been lost. They would only stir the wound for him and her. She didn't send the letter. In it, she trembled and wrote the words, "Dear Silas, I don't know if you will ever be able to read this. I am writing because living with this guilt is almost unbearable. You were the best husband I could wish for, and I betrayed you at the most difficult moment. There is no forgiveness for me, but I still ask, forgive me. I can't return your trust and love, but I want you to know that I have always loved you truly. Thank you for all the good things that happened between us." These and other confessions remained on paper. Laurel gathered her courage and folded the letter and hid it in the far drawer of her desk. All that was left was to live on and hope that someday he would find happiness, and she would earn forgiveness, at least in the eyes of her own conscience. On a cool autumn evening after a busy day, Laurel was walking home. Golden leaves crunched under her feet. The city was preparing for winter. She stopped at a small flower shop on the way and unexpectedly bought a bouquet of autumn wildflowers. She didn't really know why. She just wanted to bring some color into her life. As she walked up the stairs to her apartment, she found herself thinking about tomorrow's plans, about new patients, and not thinking about Silas for the last few days. This discovery was both sad and encouraging at the same time. Entering her now cozy home, Laurel placed the flowers in a vase on the windowsill. A new stage was beginning, perhaps without those she loved, but perhaps with hope ahead. She made herself some herbal tea and, wrapped in a blanket, sat by the window. The autumn wind swayed the trees outside. Laurel put the cup to her lips and thought that perhaps for the first time in a long time, she simply wanted a quiet, calm happiness without storms and passions, but honest and deserved. There could still be light in her life, if she herself allowed it to come in. It had been about 6 months since Silas had begun his new life. Summer was drawing to a close, and he was surprised to realize that in the last few months he had not felt the sharp, paralyzing pain that had haunted him immediately after the divorce. The sadness was still there, but it had become part of the background rather than an all-consuming feeling. He tried to fill his time with activities. As planned, he joined a gym and swam 3 mornings a week. His back was stronger. A recent checkup by a doctor had confirmed that he had fully recovered from the operation. This gave Silas confidence. His physical strength was returning, along with his mental balance. He also returned to playing the guitar. In the evenings, instead of replaying unpleasant memories in his head, Silas picked up an old acoustic guitar and played familiar chords. At first, his fingers were stiff, but gradually the melodies of his youth began to come alive. Music was therapeutic for the half-hour or hour he played. His mind was at peace. Work was also going well. Management appreciated his diligence and professionalism. In July, he was entrusted with heading a small engineering project, his first management experience during his time at the company. Silas threw himself into the tasks head-on: drawings, calculations, meetings with clients. Finally, he had a goal unrelated to his personal drama. Colleagues noticed that he had become more focused and proactive. But the most important step was that Silas decided to work on his inner state. He visited a psychologist several times a month, the same family consultant Nora Hale, but this time individually. At first, he felt awkward going alone, but Nora accepted him with understanding. At these meetings, he spoke openly about what was going on in his soul, about anger, resentment, disappointment. At one of the sessions, Nora asked cautiously, "Can you remember a specific moment when you felt this gap between you particularly acutely?" For a moment, they were both silent. Then Laurel spoke hesitantly, looking away. "I remember. A couple of months after the surgery, Silas was feeling better. One evening I tried to." She hesitated, choosing her words. "Well, hug him, kiss him. I just wanted to be close. It had been a long time." And he pulled away, said he was tired and wanted to sleep, turned over. Laurel's voice wavered. "Then I went to the bathroom to cry quietly so as not to disturb him." Silence fell over the room. Silas nodded heavily, remembering that evening. "Yes, I remember. My back hurt after training, and I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to." He stopped, choosing his words. "I wouldn't be able to be her husband. I was ashamed, and I pretended to be asleep." Laurel surreptitiously wiped away a tear. "I thought then that you were no longer attracted to me, that I was alone in my desires." Silas turned to her. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was just afraid that I would feel pain again or disappoint you." "Thank you for sharing this," Nora said softly, seeing that emotions were running high. She made a note in her notebook. "This episode is very telling. You both felt lonely and misunderstood." They both nodded quietly, wiping their eyes. After that meeting, Silas rethought a lot of things. Of course, he was far from completely calm. There were nights when he lay alone and old memories crawled from the corners of his mind: how Laurel had once laughed with him, how she had held his hand. Then tears would come, and he would allow himself to grieve for the love he had lost. But in the morning he got up and moved on. He had developed new habits. Every Sunday he would go out into the countryside for a bike ride or a hike with a nature group he had joined. There, walking along forest paths, he learned to enjoy simple things: a new fresh air, the sun shining through the trees, the pleasant tiredness at the end of the day. One day, in early September, Silas and a group of other enthusiasts took a route along a river in a suburban park. The path wound through trees golden with autumn, the first fallen leaves crunching underfoot. He walked lightly, with a backpack over his shoulder, the sound of his trekking pole hitting the ground in time with his steps. Nearby, two new acquaintances were animatedly discussing the upcoming marathon. Someone was humming a hiking song behind him. Silas found himself enjoying every minute of the walk. At the rest stop, he sat on the river bank, watching the golden glow of the sunset play on the water, and felt a deep peace. At that moment, he thought, "I made it." After all he had been through, he could once again enjoy the present, albeit alone, but without the burden on his soul. Sometimes he thought about the future. Would he ever be able to start a new relationship? For a long time, the very thought of it seemed alien. But one day, his colleague Mark invited him to go to a bar with his friends in the evening. Silas agreed. In a noisy pub, listening to rock music, he met a girl named Hannah, a friend of Mark's friend. Hannah turned out to be bright and witty. They laughed together at their mutual friends' jokes, argued about which film deserved to be called the best of the year, and shared funny stories from work. "You actually managed to build that old motorcycle yourself?" Hannah raised her eyebrows in surprise at one point in the conversation. "Yeah, a weekend project," Silas smiled, feeling the long-forgotten warmth of carefree flirting. "I never got around to letting it out on the road, though. It's sitting in the garage, gathering dust. I never got around to finishing it." "I hope you don't leave him," she winked. "You'll see, someday you'll give me a ride with the wind." He laughed. It's working. As soon as I finish it, I'll call you right away." Having exchanged phone numbers at parting, Silas was not sure whether he would call. But the very fact that he enjoyed flirting, listening to women's laughter, and catching an interesting look was encouraging. He felt life was beginning to sparkle with new colors. One day, as Silas was walking home from work, he realized he hadn't thought about Laurel for a whole day. That had been unthinkable before. He stopped at the door of the apartment, touched the handle, and suddenly smiled for the first time so sincerely in a long time. Life went on. His life, albeit different, but not finished, but moving forward. Laurel had also reached the final stage of her inner work by this time. After a year of regular therapy, she felt she could move forward without the constant support of a psychologist. At 36, she felt like a completely different person than she had a year and a half earlier. One evening, Laurel sat at a small table in her cozy studio, leafing through her diary entries. On the advice of her therapist, she kept a feelings diary. She recorded her emotions, experiences, and achievements. The pages from a year ago were full of self-accusations and pain. "I hate myself for what I did. Every day I think about how he suffered because of me." But as the months passed, the entries changed. The recent lines increasingly showed reconciliation and hope. "I'm learning to live again. Today I smiled without falsehood for the first time. I think I'm starting to forgive myself." She picked up her pen and opened a blank page. After a moment's thought, she carefully wrote, "I forgive myself. I forgive him. I let go of the past." Laurel felt a sudden lightness in her soul as she said these words. She realized that she was truly beginning to let go. A few days later, Laurel noticed a change in her outward appearance as well. Melanie, dropping in for a cup of tea, suddenly said, "You know, it's like you're glowing from the inside. You're a completely different Laurel than you were a year ago." Laurel smiled back, "I just feel better breathing now." Her friend winked, "That's great. It's time for us to go out and have fun sometime, maybe even meet someone." Laurel just shook her head with a smile, making no promises, but inside she felt that the prospect of ever letting new feelings into her life no longer scared her. Around the same time, Silas's friends noticed his transformation. Mark invited him to a bar one evening, and there, watching Silas cheerfully argue baseball with a group, he whispered to a mutual friend, "Here's our good old Cy back. We almost lost the guy." Silas, hearing his nickname out of the corner of his ear, only smiled to himself. He really felt like he was himself again, only stronger and wiser. After a year of working with a psychologist, Laurel felt it was time to end therapy. The last meeting was especially emotional. Laurel thanked the therapist for her help, and the therapist noted the journey her patient had made from self-flagellation to self-acceptance. One evening, Laurel sat at her laptop, rereading the last pages of her diary. She closed the diary and looked out the window. The lights of the city were coming on in the twilight. Somewhere out there, on the other side of this big world, lived Silas. She rarely allowed herself to think about him, but now the thought came to her, and surprisingly, it did not cause a sharp attack of shame or longing. Instead, Laurel felt a quiet sadness and gratitude for the years they had spent together, for all the good things he had given her. "I hope you're happy," she whispered into the silence of the room, mentally addressing her ex-husband. No tears came to her eyes, only a slight smile touched her lips. That evening, she put an old record of their favorite jazz tune on the record player and, wrapped in a blanket, allowed herself to remember Silas without self-flagellation, simply as a once dear person for whom she sincerely wished well. Both Silas and Laurel had finally found peace in their hearts these days, accepting the past. They did not know that fate would soon arrange an unexpected meeting for them, a test of their new, changed selves, and perhaps a chance to test how solid their peace had become. Another year passed. Time had done its work. Wounds that had once seemed fatal had healed with thin scars. Silas and Laurel's lives went on as usual, almost never crossing paths during this period, and although they did not maintain contact, each of them in their own way came to relative inner harmony. One bright spring day, Silas walked out of the psychologist's office, perhaps for the last time. At his farewell session, Nora noted how much he had changed. "You've done a lot of work on yourself. I think you're ready to move on your own," she said warmly as she said goodbye. Silas thanked Nora for her help. He felt light as he walked along the sidewalk in the bright midday sun. The May breeze caressed his face, and the smiling people around him hurried about their business. Even the city seemed to reflect his inner elation. As he passed a bookstore window, he caught sight of his reflection in the glass and barely recognized himself. Calm face, straight posture. Remembering himself a year ago, bent under the weight of grief, Silas sighed softly with gratitude. Yes, there was a scar on his heart, but he had learned to live with it. That evening, he was going through old emails at home and came across old correspondence with Laurel, short messages from before all the troubles. There was a birthday message, a funny meme she had sent, a quick, "Love you, have a nice day," from her in the middle of some workday, and a sweet grumble. "Don't forget to pick up some milk on the way home, you idiot darling." Such simple, homely phrases. There was a discussion of a weekend plan, full of funny emojis. There was a selfie she had sent him from their walk together, with the caption, "Love us like this." These carefree letters now read like a chronicle of a small, happy life gone by. Silas read a few of these letters and found himself smiling warmly. Instead of the usual stab of pain, he felt a quiet gratitude for the good things that had happened between them. Closing the folder with the letters, he whispered, "I hope you're happy, Laurel." It was not a question or a reproach, but rather a sincere wish that made him feel calm. Meanwhile, Laurel had also reached the final stage of her inner work. After a year of regular therapy, she felt she could move forward without the constant support of a psychologist. At 36, she felt like a completely different person than she had been a year and a half earlier. One evening, Laurel sat at her laptop, flipping through her journal entries from the past few months. She picked up a pen and carefully wrote on a blank page, "I forgive myself. I forgive him. I let go." The words made her feel lighter. She really had let go. The mistake she had made would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her entire future. Laurel closed the journal and looked out the window. The lights of the city were coming on in the twilight. Somewhere out there, on the other side of life, was Silas. She rarely allowed herself to think about him, but now the thoughts did not hurt as they once did. Instead of pain, there was a quiet regret and gratitude. "I hope you're happy," she whispered into the silence of the room, addressing her ex-husband in her thoughts. A slight smile touched her lips. That evening, she put an old jazz record on the record player, the one they used to listen to together. She wrapped herself in a blanket and allowed herself a little nostalgia. The past no longer frightened her or caused her acute torment. Laurel wished Silas well and felt a heavy weight lifted from her shoulders. Fate had already prepared a gift for them, a chance meeting after a long separation. They did not know about it, living their quiet lives, but very soon they were destined to see each other again. Late Saturday morning, Silas strolled through the farmer's market in downtown Milwaukee. Brightly colored stalls lined the market, mountains of colorful fruits and vegetables, the aroma of freshly baked goods, buckets of wildflowers. From all sides came the voices of vendors inviting people to try this or that product, children's laughter, the jingle of coins. Townspeople strolled leisurely between the rows with bags and baskets. The atmosphere of the Saturday market was lively and good-natured. Here and there people stopped to chat. Someone tried cherries right off the counter. Someone took pictures of colorful bouquets. The sun was warm. The air was filled with the aromas of fresh bread and greenery. Silas liked to come here for the local honey, and just like that, to feel the life of the city, to watch the people. He stopped at a honey counter, chatting with the seller about the different varieties. Taking a jar of linden honey, Silas thanked the seller and walked away, continuing to look around. He was in a light mood, a day off without any special plans ahead, and this was pleasant. As he approached the row of flower stalls, he suddenly noticed a familiar silhouette. A woman in a light summer dress stood at a stand with wildflowers, her back to him. Light brown shoulder-length hair so familiar. Silas froze for a moment. His heart involuntarily sped up. She turned her profile, selecting flowers, and there was no doubt about it. It was Laurel. His ex-wife held a small bouquet of daisies and spoke to the salesperson, smiling at the corner of her lips. Salas felt a whirlwind of emotions, surprise, shyness, an unexpected surge of excitement. He hadn't seen her for almost 2 years. In his mind, he had imagined the chance meeting many times. He seemed ready, after all, everything had long since been lived through and forgiven. But now Silas found himself unable to move, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace of the moment. Laurel looked calm and a little sad at the same time, or was it his imagination? However, she smiled at the seller, paying for the bouquet. Taking the flowers, Laurel turned and took a couple of steps towards the alley. And then their eyes met. She saw him too. For a second, Laurel's face looked surprised, as if she had seen a ghost. She stopped, holding the bouquet. Silas felt his throat go dry, but he found the strength to smile softly, genuinely, though nervously. He came slowly closer. Laurel took a step toward him, her eyes widening and her lips parted, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. Silas, she said almost silently. Hello, Laurel, he said quietly, his heart pounding in his throat, but his voice surprisingly even. They froze a few steps away from each other, embarrassed and unsure of what to do. The moment seemed to last forever. People were still passing by, some were laughing, merchants were calling out to customers, but for the two of them, time seemed to have stopped. Finally, Silas swallowed hard and asked timidly, How? How are you? Laurel blinked, coming to her senses. I'm fine, she answered just as quietly. And you? The same, he nodded. They were silent again for a second. Then Laurel looked down at the bouquet in her hands and said, a little nervously, I can't even believe that we ran into each other like this. Yes, Silas agreed, feeling the initial shock gradually pass. I didn't recognize you at first. He stopped, realizing it wasn't true. He recognized her instantly. Laurel realized it too and couldn't help but smile slightly. A lot of time has passed. Silas nodded. Almost 2 years. Aha. She pressed the daisies to her chest, not knowing what to do with her free hand. People around them were walking around the couple, who suddenly stopped in the middle of the passage. Silas caught himself. Maybe we should step aside. We won't interfere. Yes, of course, Laurel nodded quickly. They moved away toward the fence of the park, where it was a little quieter. Silas felt his ability to breathe normally returning. Laurel stood next to him, so close that he could smell the delicate scent of the wildflowers in her bouquet. You look good, he said quietly, trying to start a conversation and really noticing to himself that Laurel hadn't changed much, the same soft features, the familiar curve of her lips, except that her gaze had become a little more thoughtful. Laurel looked a little embarrassed and responded, Thank you. You too. It seems even better than before, I think. Silas smiled. Perhaps. I spend a lot of time outdoors. They both fell silent, looking at each other. Laurel's eyes were shining, either from excitement or from the sun's rays. Silas realized that for the first time in a long time he was looking at her and not feeling pain. Only a warm, strange feeling, like the joy of seeing an old friend. It's so unexpected. Laurel breathed, looking at him with a cautious smile. I've often wondered what I would say to you if I suddenly saw you. Silas raised his eyebrows. And what would you say? Laurel looked down. I don't know. Now it's all gone out of my head. They both laughed quietly, a little strained but genuine. The ice was broken. Oddly enough, this awkward crossing of paths was beginning to turn into a normal conversation between two people who had something to say to each other. A few minutes later, they were sitting on a bench near a coffee stand next to the market. Silas had insisted on getting them each a cup of cappuccino. Now, holding the warm cups in their hands, they tried to make up for lost time with careful questions and answers. Are you still working at that engineering firm? Laurel asked first, wrapping her fingers around her glass. It was easier for her to talk about something neutral. Yes, Silas nodded. It's been there for 10 years now. You know, I was even promoted to team leader last year. Really? Congratulations, she smiled sincerely. You were always talented and hardworking. They appreciated it. Silas accepted the compliment with gratitude. Thank you. And you? Still in physiotherapy? Yes, Laurel took a sip of coffee. I changed jobs about a year ago. I'm at a halfway house on Riverside Drive now. I've heard of it, he responded. It seems like a good place. Very, she confirmed. The team is wonderful. The conditions are excellent. I like it there. He nodded, briefly imagining her in her new surroundings. Then he asked hesitantly, You took back your maiden name? Laurel looked down and nodded slowly. Yes, it seemed right. She looked at him a little guiltily. I hope it didn't offend you. It's all right, Silas interrupted her gently. I understand. There was a brief pause. They both realized that for the first time they had touched something of the painful layer, but, surprisingly, neither felt any sharp pain. Laurel changed the subject. Do you still live in that area? No, he answered calmly. I sold the house right after the divorce. Now I'm renting an apartment closer to the center. Laurel snorted. It's clear. She was silent for a moment, then decided to ask. And, do you live alone or with someone? Silas caught the subtext, but was not offended. The question was asked carefully, without a hint of jealousy, rather, it sounded caring. One, he answered openly. I don't have a steady relationship, if that's what you mean. There have been acquaintances, but nothing serious. I see, she said quietly. Deep down, she felt better about his answer, although she didn't understand why. I don't have anything like that either. He smiled briefly. I think we both decided to take our time on this issue. Laurel responded with a smile. Perhaps so. They paused, sipping their coffee. Gradually, the awkwardness subsided. The conversation began to flow more freely, moving from topic to topic. Laurel told of a funny story at work, how a young patient tried to cheat and leave a session early by pretending to be healthier than he was. She and her colleagues later laughed along with the guy when the ruse was exposed. Silas shared a story about how their department was starting a new project and mistakenly sent the plans to the wrong construction company. They had to apologize and send them again, and how his boss joked that it was a test of the team leader's nerve. They laughed and commiserated and wondered, like old friends who had not seen each other for a long time. After about half an hour, Laurel found herself looking at Silas and enjoying himself. He really did look happy. It was reflected in his eyes, in the relaxed features of his face, in the ease with which he laughed. Before, he had often been tense, serious, and now it was as if he had found an inner light. Laurel looked at him more closely. How is your back after the surgery? Is everything okay? Excellent, he smiled. I did conscientiously perform all the exercises you once showed me. So, I can say you cured me completely. Laurel even exhaled with relief and smiled too. I'm glad. Sometimes I remembered how you suffered then. It's good that now it's all behind us. After a short silence, she changed the subject. Do you still play the guitar? I remember you loved it. Yes, a little, he nodded, surprised that she remembered such details. And do you still run in the mornings like you used to? I run, she laughed a little more freely. And you know, I even thought about signing up for a marathon for amateurs recently. Wow, Silas exclaimed. Keep it up. They both smiled, each feeling warmer that old habits and hobbies had not been forgotten. I'm so glad to see you like this, she suddenly said quietly, putting down her empty glass. The words came out of nowhere. What kind? He asked with gentle curiosity. Laurel was a little embarrassed by her frankness, but she explained anyway. Calm, content with life. You're smiling. That's great. Silas looked down, feeling a pleasant warmth from her words. Thank you. To be honest, I'm also glad to see you. Well, that you're okay. She nodded gratefully. There was a moment of silence between them, but it no longer seemed awkward. On the contrary, there was a quiet understanding in it. Suddenly, Silas smiled wider. The other day I drove past that campsite on Lake Michigan where we once vacationed. I remember Laurel's eyes brightened with recollection. The storm started at night, and we were sitting in a tent by candlelight, drinking hot tea. And sang songs with a guitar, he continued, laughing. Yes, it was great. Laurel sighed quietly. It was a good time. Silas nodded. I'm glad that now I can remember it with a smile. Me too, she admitted. At that moment, a barefoot toddler ran past, escaping from his parents, and tripped, landing right next to their bench. Laurel immediately jumped up and helped the little one up. Oh, be careful. Did you hurt yourself? The boy, realizing what had happened, wrinkled his nose, ready to burst into tears, but Laurel patted him on the shoulder soothingly. Everything is fine. Look, you're not even scratched. Hero. The child looked at her seriously, then, as if in agreement, held back his tears. The mother, who had arrived, smiled gratefully at Laurel, taking her son by the hand. When they left, Silas laughed quietly. You are a born therapist. You heal not only the body, but also any tears. Laurel sheepishly adjusted a stray strand of hair. I've just been working with different people for a long time, and I love children very much, I guess. He noticed a special softness in the look with which she saw the baby off. You always wanted children, he said quietly, and immediately bit his tongue, thinking that perhaps he shouldn't broach the subject. But Laurel didn't look upset. She just smiled sadly. Yes, it didn't work out. She met his eyes and added, plucking up her courage. But I'm glad you'll be fine. I'm sure you'll be a great father someday. Silas wanted to answer, but for some reason there was a lump in his throat. He only looked at her gratefully. There was another pause, this time filled with the lingering echo of what had not been said. Almost an hour passed unnoticed as they talked. The coffee they had drunk had cooled, and the sun was already high in the sky. Laurel was the first to notice how much time had passed. I guess I should go. I just went out to buy groceries, and it's already been half a day, she said with a light laugh, although there was a note of regret in her voice. Of course, Silas replied, realizing that it was time for him to go too. I was planning on visiting a friend today too. They rose from the bench and hesitated, looking at each other. The inevitable moment of farewell suddenly seemed too soon. So much remained unsaid, or maybe everything important was already understood without words. Laurel shifted from one foot to the other, clutching the nearly forgotten bouquet of daisies to her chest. Finally, she took a deep breath. Silas, I have to tell you, forgive me for everything. I know that nothing can be fixed, but all these years I have lived with regret. She looked him straight in the eyes, and in her pupils he saw a sincere plea for understanding. I'm so sorry I hurt you. You don't have to answer, I just wanted you to know that. Silas felt his heart tighten. He nodded slowly. Thank you for saying that. He searched for words for a few seconds, then continued quietly. And you, forgive me. Maybe I wasn't perfect then either. I thought about it a lot. We are both to blame for our marriage cracking. Laurel shook her head, her eyes shining. No, you are not guilty of anything. It was me. H. Silas stopped her gently. Let's not do this. I forgave everything long ago, really. The past is in the past. He smiled slightly, warmly, and openly. Laurel felt tears of relief welling up in her eyes. She looked down, trying to hold them back. You are an amazing person. Not at all, he shook his head. Time just helps you understand a lot. Laurel exhaled, controlling her emotions, and tried to smile too. I'm glad you're doing well. You deserve to be happy. And you too, he said firmly. I really hope you'll find him. I'm sure of it. She looked at him gratefully. A moment later, they both stepped forward and embraced awkwardly. It was a short, friendly embrace, but there was forgiveness and warmth in it. For a brief moment, Silas saw images of years past, them as young men dancing at their wedding to the applause of the guests, Laurel smiling at him on the shore of the lake, beaming with happiness. These memories no longer hurt, they were a dear, safe part of his heart. Laurel's cheek was wet. One unbidden tear had rolled down during the embrace, leaving a wet mark on Silas's shirt. When they pulled away, both were slightly embarrassed, but there were smiles on their faces. "Well, goodbye," Laurel said quietly, clutching the bouquet. "See you later," Silas corrected her softly. She nodded. "See you." Laurel turned and walked down the market alley, looking back at him over her shoulder. Silas stood watching her until she disappeared into the motley crowd. Laurel wiped away a single tear as she walked away, but there was a small smile on her face. She felt suddenly lighter, as if a heavy burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders. There was no pain or bitterness in his chest, only a bright sadness and at the same time a strange joy. This chance meeting became the last necessary point for both of them. They both changed, matured, and managed to let go of the past. Silas took a deep breath of warm air and moved in the opposite direction, toward his day and his future life, knowing in his heart that everything would be fine for both of them. The sky above the city was clear, and Silas walked with a surprising lightness. Life went on, and he smiled at it. Behind him, the noise of the market square gradually died down, and ahead, the avenue roared with passing cars and people hurrying about their business. The city lived its own life, and Silas again felt himself a part of it, full of hope and open to new roads. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.